You're watching Full View. I'm Tshepiso Makwetla, and this is On the Record. Now, South Africa has seen a wave of violence involving young people in the past couple of months. So weekly, amateur videos filmed during school hours appear on social media, showing vicious brawls, mostly involving students, but also targeting educators. Worryingly, these violent pandemic points to a broader concern within the education system. However, in South Africa, youth violence has a long history and is experienced by a significant portion of the country's youth. Youth violence is also deeply normalized in the country, as for many decades, youth have been involved in political, criminal and gang-related violent activity. It's fundamentally influenced by high levels of violence throughout South African society at large. And joining us in a short moment is Kgalalelo Kedijang, Project Manager, Not Yet Uhuru, Soul City Institute. Themba Masango is in our Soweto studios. He's with Not In My Name, and we'll also be speaking to Fasiha Hassan of #FeesMustFall activists. But first, let me welcome you, Themba, and thank you so much for joining us. Your view of the insurgence, if you were, of violence in school, is it an escalation or is it really nothing new?
I definitely think that it is an escalation. I'm also wanting to use the word pandemic because we've never seen in our history where violence in schools perpetrated by both students and tutors is just so out of hand. And I would go to the extent of saying that the issue of ill discipline in our schools stems from the point of people not knowing who they are anymore. And we are on Human Rights Day today, where we are remembering where 69 of our people were slaughtered by an evil apartheid regime for protesting for legitimate causes. And today we have forgotten the issue of human rights, that with the rights of being human, you have a responsibility of being human to another person.
So is that what you mean when you say people have forgotten who they are? They've lost their humanity. Is that what you mean?
Definitely. People have, I feel that human beings, both young and old, have lost that sense of empathy to one another, have lost that sense of respect for one another. And with the letting down of those empathetic and human bars, we are a nation that is just acting out violently. We're a nation that is acting out of impulse. And obviously with the advent of social media, anything that happens tends to go viral. And with that going viral, another child somewhere else sees this and thinks, I'll get a few more likes, I'll trend for a day and so on. And, they continue to move on in that vein. And it makes this pandemic to go out of order.
I want to ask you something, though. In a lot of those videos that we've seen, especially at schools, and we'll be looking at various incidents in just a moment, but I'd like to invite the other guests in just a moment as well. But we've seen it mostly involving and affecting young men. Is that the overall picture, or is it that we're just not seeing enough of what happens to young girls? We've obviously seen violence against young women. But just in terms of, is it boy-on-boy violence, boy on girl, girl on girl?
Well, generally speaking, you are correct to say that it is young boys acting out violently. Obviously, there are episodes and little spots where girls are also involved in a violent way. But what is very crucial here is that we are a country that seems to act out violently on things that seem to deter them, or things that seem to irritate them, instead of actually coming down and speaking about our issues.
Let's look at the root causes. Let's look at the root causes of that in just a moment. I'd like to also include the other panelists in this discussion. This is On the Record.
Hey, Baba. You've been partying the whole night.
Yeah, my darling. Hey, you complain a lot, man. If it's not the leaves, then it's the noise.
I've asked you so nicely before. Now I'm calling my lawyer.
Ooh, I am so scared. And like, where's your lawyer?
My lawyer is right here. Can't tell later.
Problems with the neighbors? Rental disputes? Advice on maintenance matters? Drawing up a will? When it comes to justice in South Africa, one voice shouts louder than any other. Clientele Legal. Our plans are affordable. They start from 165 Rand per month.
Sorry, man. My salary's late again. It was supposed to be in on the 1st and it's now the 8th.
Take it or leave it.
I'm not leaving this and I'm not taking it. I'm calling Clientele Legal.
Oh, Clientele Legal.
Labor issues? Unfair dismissal. Uncontested divorce. Unfair blacklisting. Wrongful arrest. Clientele Legal will speak up for you. SMS Legal to 32281 and we'll call you back. SMS now.
What I like about Clientele Legal is that they're affordable, they're professional, and they constantly check up on you.
Clientele Legal not only solved my debt problem, but also restored my dignity.
Clientele Legal appointed an attorney. Within 2 weeks, the settlement was drawn up, and soon thereafter, the divorce was finalized, to my great relief.
Our plans include access to a 24-hour emergency helpline. No matter how big or small your problem is, we are standing by to assist. Professional lawyers, professional advice at an affordable price. SMS Legal to 32281 and we'll call you back. SMS now.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Record. Let me just reintroduce you to my guests now. On furthest to my left is Kgalalelo Kedijang, who's project manager, not yet Uhuru Soul City Institute, and to my immediate left, Fasiha Hassan, who is a hashtag Fees Must Fall activist in our Pretoria studios, Themba Masango of Not In My Name. Welcome to you, ladies. We were just speaking with Themba about what we've seen at schools happen lately. We can talk about what happened at Mananger High School, the school in the northwest where a young boy was stabbed. There's so many. We've seen that video that went viral in the Western Cape of a teacher and a young girl in a very violent altercation. But the question is whether or not this is an escalation. And I'd like to hear your point of view, whether or not there is a particular reason why we're seeing this emergence of violence in schools or an escalation of it. Let's just start with you, Fasiha.
Look, I think we come from a very violent society, and we need to be quite honest about that. In many ways, our schools are now starting to reflect, or have actually always been reflecting, the greater society. And for us to have an honest conversation about what's going on in schools, we must then say, well, what's happening in South African society? Even when you look at instances of crime, even petty theft, it's not just stealing your cell phone, you'll get stabbed as well.
As happened just in Mananger.
Exactly. And I think it's about a much bigger issue about how I think South African society truly hasn't overcome the trauma of the past. I think we were treated with such violence, not just during apartheid, but through colonialism and all of these different things, that one of our only ways to react out in many ways is through violence by itself as well. That doesn't mean it's okay. I'm just saying that it's a much bigger issue than just in schools. It goes beyond that. In fact, if we want to fix the issue, we need to go into our societies and into our communities.
Okay, so we'll look at our environments in just a moment. We'll look at whether or not parents are abdicating their duties, as some have suggested. But Kgalalelo, not yet Uhuru, I suppose it's all in the name of this project that you're running, as Fasiha is suggesting, that it goes back to our past. The the psychological violence borne on the South African people by the apartheid system.
Yeah.
Are we saying that we are only seeing that now, that we have time, 25 years, to reflect on what it is we had to contend with?
Well, like she said, we need to also look at the home where these children are brought up, and what we're seeing is that children are reflecting the violence that they experience in the home. And what's been happening, or what we've been seeing, is that the home is, and the society is, such a violent structure, and these parents who are raising these kids lived in a time where structural violence was legal. So they are carrying intergenerational trauma and then sending schools. And I think it's also unfair to put the burden only on the Department of Basic Education to actually facilitate this healing process amongst
So Japheth Ngube wrote an article recently saying, concerning school violence in South Africa, one of the things that he points to is a disconnect between active parenting and discipline. Would you agree with that, Kgalalelo?
Of course I would agree with that. And also just looking at the forms in which we discipline our kids. If we're saying that no man should violate or hit a woman, then we have to say the same with corporal punishment, even in the home, because those things are forms of power that are used both against women and against children.
Okay. So I want to come back to you, Themba. Just looking at a study that was done in 2013, it basically found that generally boys in South Africa tend to be the most affected by violence, with the exception of sexual violence. Would you agree with that? And would you point to that as a reason for why we're seeing more and more, some would even say gratuitous violence in schools?
100%. And I think the issue is that the old age saying that says hurt people usually go out and hurt other people. And we are just having a vicious circle that's going around. And, you know, the ladies who said it correctly there, that, you know, it's intergenerational violent trends that are being passed on from generation to generation. And the whole toxic masculinity that comes out and says, for me to prove myself as a real man, I have to beat down somebody. I have to show that I've got bigger muscles, I've got bigger force, I can actually impose myself on other people. And that whole thinking is what is actually disturbing a lot of young boys growing up. And that is part of the reason why Not In My Name SA has initiated programs specifically designed for the boy child, to make him understand that you acting out violently does not make you more of a man. And a better man is one who is able to reason out a situation, a person who will be able to be compassionate towards another human being, be in touch with their own feelings, and understand that violence is not that answer in the first place.
So Fasiha, I'd like to come to you on this. As part of that study says this also means that the line between a victim and perpetrator is often very difficult to determine because of so many young perpetrators themselves having been victims of severe violence. Now, I want you to take us into this hashtag Fees Must Fall movement, because there was also a lot of psychological violence, a lot of emotional violence, a lot of spiritual violence in order to reach those goals.
Yeah. You know, it's always been a difficult topic for people to really unpack. On the one hand, I mean, we're very clear, the burning of buildings, the burning of libraries, etc., is not something that we could ever condone. But at the same time, we also need to look at the violence of the system that you've sort of spoken about, and how it systematically seeks to exclude not just poor students, but particularly black students as well. And the kinds of struggles that our students go through, a lack of accommodation, people sleeping in libraries. I mean, we had students who used to sleep in toilets, people who don't have access to food, a simple thing like that, not even having access to textbooks, and then still being, or having that expectation of being able to perform well academically like a counterpart who has all the opportunities. So for us, it's it's about more than just talking about violence, about understanding it in context. And the other important point I think we must make is also, when does society listen?
Which is what I was about to ask you. Was it more impactful because, or did students feel that they had to become more violent in order to be more impactful because that was the only time that they would be listened to?
That's what I think part of the problem is. If we look at protest culture in South Africa, very often the only time that society listens, that government listens, or even that the media will cover it, is when something burns or when it's particularly violent. And we then have to put up the mirror to ourselves as society and say, but why are we only listening then? Why are we only taking an issue seriously when it comes to that point? I think we have to self-introspect and say, but actually we should be on the ground and more involved before it even gets to that point. And I think that goes back into what I was saying earlier, that we need to be a little bit more in touch so that it doesn't get to a crisis level and so that no one feels the desperation of having to burn something or get violent in order to be listened to.
You know, Kgalalelo, just listen to what Fasiha is talking about, and some of that is symbolic, isn't it? The ways in which we protest and what we think will have impact. Some of what was very difficult to understand for people was how some of the students would strip themselves in order to get their points across. And we saw that in the activists against gender-based violence who marched on President Cyril Ramaphosa. We saw that with the Kgalalelo protests recently. And just bridging that gap for people to understand the connection between the ways in which we protest, the violence that results of it, and also the violence behind it that leads people to protest in the manner that they do.
And there's a quote that says, a riot is the cry of the unheard. And what she's saying is very symbolic, because before the Fees Must Fall movement, institutions of higher learning and townships such as TUT were rioting, were burning, were trying to be heard, but no one came. There was no media coverage. It took Western institutes with more resources like WITS and like UCT to join the movement for this movement to gain momentum. So, and also with the Kgalalelo matter, she had been going to the police, she had been trying to get the attention of officials, but no one was hearing her until she stripped, until she became nude, and only then, and then she was really tarnished. Her name was tarnished because it's nude. While female nudity, if it's not in protest, is celebrated. If we're not as women taking off our clothes, if it's for male enjoyment, then it's fine. But
isn't it a fine line to tread though? Because we are talking about violence in general in our society and also amongst youth. And the female body itself has been not only a canvas of protesting against gender-based violence, but has been used to inflict gender-based violence. So we've seen that in corrective rape. We've seen that in communities when they want to get a point across. What I'm asking is basically the environment that our children are living in and what they're seeing and what they're understanding about some of this symbolism.
And I also think that going back to the environment, the Office of the Rights of the Child, there was an office in the presidency which was dismantled, and then all the children's issues were put into the Department of Social Development, which then tells children that your rights are only important insofar as social protection, insofar as welfare, but there is no structure in government right now that looks at the child holistically outside of those needs. And that's something that government really needs to say. In the manifestos, they speak about children, but not to children directly. They are written in a language that is not accessible to children, which then says that children are not important to politicians. Children are not important to the government.
I mean, Themba, I'd like to come back to you. Just looking at some of the violent incidents that we've also seen go viral on video, which have been very, very disturbing, is also of young boys, young men inflicting sexual violence on young girls. And we've seen that also happen to young boys in some instances. So the question is, and that separation that Kgalalelo points to in how we deal with some problems which are really holistic as a community, is that also part of the problem? And I know, not in my name, that's part of the reason why you have the movement. But is it our approach in dealing with violence as a community that has also become problematic?
100%. And I think also we need to go back to the root cause of the thing, and to, us in the African culture would say that it takes a village to raise a child. Nowadays you don't have a situation where a child passing through your street will see an elder person as a mother or as a father. It's just my neighbor who I don't even know. And those traditions that we had have slowly departed, where we are no longer seeing one another as human beings. Even the word sawubona, translated meaning that I see you. And before we are males, before we are females, before we are this political party or the other, we need to come back to a point where we see each other as human beings. And I guess that's why we're having the day of
But let's take Human Rights Day as an example, Themba.
Right.
I'm looking at Human Rights Day, and you have all mentioned the fact that it's because we see this violence in our communities. Just looking at various studies, they'll tell you that children have experienced violence either by their caretakers, or seeing a family member being beaten, or being beaten brutally by a parent or a caregiver. So when we talk about Human Rights Day, some say it has just become an innate part of our society, that violence, that people are just unable to distinguish and even realize where the rights begin and end.
Right. And, with rights, once again, comes responsibility. And we need to be able to come back as a country to understand that we need to see each other as human first, before we can move on to start even talking about male, female, black, white, student, teacher. We need to be able to see one another as human beings. And because we are human beings, we need to be empathetic, and we need to be able to understand that we may be different, and be able to understand one another's different points of view, and express our misunderstandings and in a non-violent manner. Because we have seen that a lot of struggles have been won in a non-violent manner. I mean, you look back in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, you look into the Satyagraha movement of Gandhi and so on, people who made sure that we are not going to be violent. However, our point is going to be put across, and everybody is going to hear it.
Okay.
And we need to bring back that type of culture.
Themba, allow me to, I'm going to ambush you here, Fasiha, because it's something that we've spoken about before, on the sidelines of events. And we had Adam Abib here speak about his new book, Rage and Rebels, Rebels and Rage. And I'm thinking about, within a protest movement, there's also that other violence, just whether it's between the sexes, or if you take 5 steps forward, you're also taking 5 steps back in a certain category of that fight in general for humanity. The impact on the feminist movement in the Fees Must Fall movement or campaign, what was that? And did you all feel like a cohesive at the end, or was it that at the end of it, while you were fighting as a collective, there were still areas that then further regressed?
I think it was a combination, actually. One of the things that was, I don't know why it was shocking, but it did end up being shocking to us, particularly as women leaders, as feminists, was how there were many patriarchal and misogynistic elements that had creeped into the movement. And I remember very particularly trying to advance the feminist struggle and say that women, not just myself, but all of these women on the front lines, we would address mass meetings, for example, and people would chatter and talk, but no one did that when male leaders spoke, So the different kinds of rules that were applied to us. And when we raised it, we were told, we were being divisive, that the goal's only about free education, we'll deal with feminism later, we'll deal with women's rights later. And we had to put our foot down and say, well, actually, there is no later. It's now.
And the irony of that, Fasiha, is that the rape of young women in institutions of higher learning was smack bang in the middle of that hashtag Fees Must Fall.
Exactly. We even saw sexual violence and sexual sort of perpetration happening during Fees Must Fall. And I think particularly at UCT, it was very, it was prominent and it happened.
And Grahamstown
exactly.
as
well. And that all led into this greater student movement about not just women, but allies of the movement saying that we're not going to turn a blind eye. And more importantly, we're going to face this issue head on. And you spoke a little bit about nude protests earlier. I think I must come in here and say that for us, it was also an act of desperation. What more do we have to do? That no matter whether we are wearing clothes or not wearing clothes, whether we are leaders or whether we are not leaders, no matter what we do, we are always in danger. And it's not just about always being in danger, it's about a level of dignity that's not being afforded.
Is that why, for instance, just looking at some of the visuals here, why we're seeing even young children joining their parents in protests? Fasiha, you can answer, and then Kgalalelo, you can ask, and I'll come to you, Themba, as well.
Yeah, look, I think we're seeing an emergence of sort of more active young people. This doesn't mean everybody is active. We'll always have an apathetic group. But I think that we are starting to see a generation of young people who are saying, we're going to get involved in this particular issue, whether it be about gender-based violence, education, healthcare. We're seeing many different things. And in many ways, it's actually very encouraging to see people go to the front lines and actually want to do something about it.
Kgalalelo, what is your sense of that? And I'm also looking at the peer environment where some of these issues occur and incidents occur as well. I mean, just looking at some of that, the incidents of youth violence that we've seen just in this year alone, it involves cyberbullying, it involves mob mentality. So how do we negotiate this space?
I think technology comes with advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that we've seen a lot of digital activism rise up with the Fees Must Fall, with the total shutdown. We've seen how the internet has become a tool for mobilizing, but also we've also seen the dire effects of technology through the Thoriso matter, how young people use their cell phones to gloat about violence or to get some sort of recognition within the communities, because what they've seen is the gangsters in their communities are celebrated. So what are they going to do? They're going to film themselves doing all these violence acts to be celebrated, to trend. We all want to trend. We all want social approval now because of Instagram and all these other things that are happening in our sphere. So technology has posed a danger to children because it's exposing them to so much violence. It's so easy for a child to pick up on a hashtag and watch gruesome videos, but also what it's given young people is a tool to get involved in the conversation.
And Themba, that brings me to that, the fact that the violence is perpetrated by their peers, so there's no one really to learn from, and it seems to become a norm. So what does your movement do to discourage young people from just following suit? I mentioned mob mentality. It just almost seems like a feverish reaction by some when you watch some of these videos that somebody's doing it to somebody who's just like me, so I might as well do it.
You're right. Right. Obviously, we are obviously encouraged by the rise of different organizations and movements that are creating a sense of activism in and amongst young people, especially through social media. However, we have to keep vigilant and guard those who are intent on undermining our civil liberties and coming in and becoming rogue elements within the different movements that we represent, and starting to push issues of violence, misogyny, gender-based violence, assault towards the other fellow comrades that are pushing the same thing. And just remembering the Thoriso case in Limpopo, it was just a bunch of young kids who were influencing one another in a very terrible manner, and even went to boast about it on social media, because everybody wants to trend, everybody wants to have a like, and so on.
All right, so let's trend for the right. Let's trend for the right reasons.
For the right thing.
Let's train for the right reasons. Ladies, in 30 seconds,
we do the right thing.
In 30 seconds, your final words. Fasiha?
Look, I think I've been clear that the issue of violence is systemic, and I think we need to go down to the root, go into communities, and also just be honest about it. I think turning a blind eye or pretending things are okay, not going to help anybody.
Kgalalelo?
We need a feminist government. I think if more feminists are moved into higher places of power and have a right to dictate how communities work, violence amongst children will decrease.
Thank you very much to all of you. That was Kgalalelo Kedijang, Project Manager, not yet Uhuru Soul City Institute, Fasiha Hassan, #FeesMustFall activists, and in our Pretoria studios, Themba, Masango of Not In My Name. Thank you, all of you. This has been On The Record.